On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this discussion about the future of arms control and what we can take as lessons from recent history. We've got two great speakers with us today to share their expertise on Russia, on arms control specifically, their knowledge of the American political process, and as an organization that studies the relationship between the executive and Congress, that relationship is certainly key in any discussion about nuclear arms control and the road ahead. And we are just delighted to have Rose Gottemoeller join us today. And we have also, in addition to having her with us for this hour, she has just written a book, Negotiating the New START Treaty, that lays out a lot of these lessons. And so we thank her for joining us to share some of the top lines from what she has put in the book and maybe a few additional anecdotes. I do want to talk about just a few of the highlights of Rose's career for the benefit of the audience by way of introduction before I turn it over to Ambassador Pickering to moderate a conversation. But Ms. Gottemoeller was a Deputy Undersecretary General at NATO, was also served as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and prior to that, the Assistant Secretary for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance, during which time she acted as the principal U.S. negotiator for the New START Treaty. She spent some time as the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center and is currently the Frank E. and Arthur W. Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford and has a connection to CSPC through that role as it is at the Freeman Spogli Institute. And Brad Freeman is one of the trustees at CSPC. So we're particularly proud of that connection. But Rose, just delighted to have you here and thank you for making the time available to us. I'm going to tell the audience that there will be an opportunity, we hope, for audience Q&A. And so we'll take as many questions as we can get to in the latter part of the hour today. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen whenever you feel moved. I'm going to turn it over now to CSPC Board Chair, Ambassador Tom Pickering, to lead a conversation. Of course, Tom is someone who's very familiar with the issues, having been U.S. Ambassador to Russia, in addition to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and a number of other countries, a Vice Chair now at Hills and Company, but somebody who's deeply involved in the history of U.S.-Russia relations and the United States work on arms control. And we couldn't have a better person to moderate a conversation with Rose Gottemoeller than Ambassador Pickering. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it over to you to lead us off. And when you feel the time is right, you can send it back to us to start fielding the audience questions. Thank you both.
Thank you, Glenn, very much. Rose, it's always an honor and a pleasure to have you. And thank you very much for agreeing to join us, particularly at the early hour this morning. My congratulations on your new book. We all understand and believe that it will add, as always, as you always do, to the corpus of knowledge that we have, both about stabilizing the nuclear deterrent in the broad basis and dealing with Russia in a more narrow but not insignificant set of confines. I want to start generally and perhaps move more particularly in the questions and answers for the first half of this hour. To do so, perhaps I could begin with a very simple question. We're all, I think, particularly pleased that Biden and Putin moved to extend New START for the full 5 years. What do you see as the next steps in U.S.-Russia efforts toward nuclear disarmament and stability? How and in what way should they be timed? Should they in any sense deal with IMF and or the tactical nuclear weapons question? and to add further to complexities, China. But that brings in one lasso, a lot of the critical current issues. And I'll give you a chance to talk about those, perhaps as an opening statement, if you like, but whatever way you'd like to handle those.
Very good, Ambassador Pickering, Tom, and it's an honor to be on with you this morning. I have to say, I'll tell a small vignette about my early work with you, and that is when you were ambassador in Moscow during the Clinton administration. And I was working on what became the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program with the Russians, and working on some other ambitious cooperative efforts, such as establishing our space cooperation. And you were always hugely supportive of that effort, and also very clever at dealing with the Russians, who are always up to tricks. So I do say that I learned a lot of what I know from working with you. So it's an honor for me to be on this Zoom call with you today. Now the agenda going forward, I'm very pleased that we have a stable environment for the next 5 years to work on that agenda going forward. I understand that there were people out there who said we should try to continue to leverage the Russians as well as the US bureaucracy with shorter extensions of New START. But as you know, and as anybody who's engaged in a complex negotiation, if it's a very short period right at the outset, then there can be all kinds of leverage games as the two sides attempt to trade the blame for who's going to have the failure in the negotiation. And to my mind, it wastes a lot of time. So I was very glad to see the extension that President Biden and President Putin agreed to quickly of 5 years, because it gives us a stable environment to negotiate in the next phases. But more importantly, to my mind, it gives us a stable environment in which to implement the modernization of our nuclear forces, our nuclear arsenal. And I think that is important also for US national security, because the Russians, having just completed the modernization of their own nuclear arsenal, have a lot of capacity for building additional weapons and additional delivery vehicles if they wish to do so. They have what we call hot production lines. So I think it's in our interest to keep that Russian arsenal under strict limits for the next 5 years as we carry out our own modernization. So that is one reason, and I think actually it's the most important reason for this full 5-year extension of the treaty. But what next in terms of the environment? I see emphasis in two related areas, and they will pull in all of the strands that you raised. First of all, we do need to proceed with further attention to reductions and limitations in strategic nuclear forces. That is the follow-on to the New START treaty. And I think in that regard, we will pay attention to placing direct limits on nuclear warheads. We've never done that before in an arms control treaty. It may seem strange to some of the listeners, but as a matter of fact, we have limited warheads by dint of eliminating their delivery vehicles. So if a missile was destroyed, the warheads were taken off, sent back to storage, and they were considered eliminated for the purpose of the treaty, but they weren't eliminated. They were sitting in central storage. So now we agree, and actually this is a bipartisan agreement, that it's time to start to limit warheads directly. And I think the Trump administration actually did us a favor in establishing the principle that this should be our next step, with getting President Putin to agree on a 1-year freeze on all nuclear warheads. Now, of course, a freeze is not a negotiated limit with verification measures, but it was also useful that the Trump administration put the Russians on notice that we should begin working on monitoring and verification for warhead limits. And so I think the stage is set. The Russians now say, well, wait a minute, that was that administration, this is this administration, Putin's agreement is off the table. But nevertheless, I think that important principle has now been established and will have to be part of our next strategic arms limitation negotiations, as well as the new and modern systems that the Russians have been deploying, some of which are constrained by New START, the Sarmat heavy ICBM, their HGV, their hypersonic glide vehicle called the Avant-Garde. It is also constrained by the New START Treaty, but they have a number of other systems, including some that have never been deployed before, such as this nuclear-propelled Buryavestnik cruise missile, which is not yet ready for deployment, but the Russians say they're getting it ready for deployment. And so we need to put some constraints on these new kinds of nuclear weapon systems as well. In addition to which, there will be a broader strategic stability discussion with the Russians, because a number of new technologies are making an appearance, and the Russians continue to be concerned about US missile defense developments. This is a long-standing concern. But we need also, in addition to negotiations, to have a broad-ranging discussion on the future of strategic stability, nuclear stability, and how new technologies are affecting strategic stability. So that's one agenda. Now, the other agenda, to my mind, is where we draw the Chinese to the table, because they will have an interest in coming to the table. With the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty gone away now, the US withdrew from it 2 years ago for good reason. The Russians were violating the treaty with a new missile called the 9M729 cruise missile. So they were, as I put it, cutting the heart out of the INF treaty. So it was high time for the United States to leave the treaty. A treaty that only constrains one party is not a treaty in our national interest, certainly. So the next step along the way, I think, will be to think about what we do about limiting and constraining intermediate range ground-launched missiles in Eurasia, where there is a proliferation of such missiles. And as a first step, I think we need to begin to talk to the Chinese about these missiles, because they have a significant number of them, and we are worried about them. We call them carrier killers. So we need to think about ways to incentivize them to come to the table. There's a complex relationship here between what Putin has proposed in Europe and what may incentivize the Chinese to come to the table. Because Putin, I guess having rethought perhaps the 9M729, is now urging the United States to come to the table and negotiate a moratorium on deploying such missiles in Europe. The Russians have never admitted that the 9M729 is an INF missile, an intermediate range missile, but they've said, we're willing to constrain it. We're willing to take it out of European Russia and monitor that fact. And so let us join in an agreement on a moratorium on deploying such missiles in Europe. That means such missiles move east of the Urals and toward China. And in addition, the United States is planning to deploy some conventionally armed intermediate range missiles on the territory of our US allies in Asia, perhaps in Guam as well. And so as a result, I think the Chinese are sitting up and taking notice that they are going to be facing some significant additional intermediate range missiles in their territory or close to their territory. And so I think that this may be an incentive for them to come to the table. So those are the two areas I see, Tom, as being top priorities to continue to work the longer range side of the equation. These are all systems that fly beyond the range of 5,500 kilometers, 5,500 kilometers and below to 500 kilometers, that's intermediate range. Deal with those as well, focusing both on a European moratorium and on working to get the Chinese to the negotiating table to place constraints on those types of missiles. So those are the two priorities, I would say, for the Biden administration moving forward. Tom, you're muted.
Do you want to say anything about tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, when I talk about placing constraints directly on warheads, I'm talking about all nuclear warheads. And this is a change. We were always before stressing the fact that Russia had more so-called tactical or non-strategic nuclear warheads than the United States. But frankly, I think that's been a bit of a false dichotomy for some time now, because the Russians use their warheads, or they deploy their warheads on various ranges of delivery vehicles without necessarily distinguishing tactical or non-strategic from strategic. So I think to directly place a limit on all nuclear warheads actually captures the tactical or non-strategic nuclear warheads.
Good, thank you very much. Let me take you back to the beginning of discussions on New START and their continuation under President Obama. Did you feel there were differences in the Russian position between Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin? And did you believe, as some have said, that Medvedev actually had decision-making authority of great significance, or was it really all up to Putin and we were very much configured to dealing with it that way?
This is a point I very much make in my book. But by the way, the book isn't quite out yet. It will be published by the Cambria Press in late April or early May. So you can order it now with Cambria Press, but it's not quite out on the street yet. But this is a point that I make in the book, that this is at least one occasion in the Medvedev presidency where I do believe that Medvedev had independent decision-making power and used it. You may recollect that Obama and Medvedev met in London early in April 1, actually, it's coming up on the anniversary of that, in 2010, and they agreed a very succinct, short statement. And the key part of that statement was that the next nuclear arms negotiation would be about strategic offensive forces. And I underscore that word offensive. They did not say anything about also limiting strategic defensive forces, missile defense. And so that was a very important, I would say, initial instruction to the negotiators. And the Russians early on started bringing missile defense to the table. But I could always point back to that London statement and say, no, our presidents agreed from the very outset that this negotiation will be about strategic offensive forces. And that was very important. But I do feel that Putin dove into the fray. He wasn't paying, I would say, a good deal of attention to the negotiations at the very beginning. But by Christmas time in 2010, he dove into the fray. And I think my view is, as recounted in my book, that he tried to blow up the negotiations at that point. And it was at that point that Medvedev stood up to him and said, no, as a matter of fact, this negotiation will continue. So it's a very interesting vignette because people often say, oh, Medvedev, he was just a figurehead. It was Putin calling all the shots. I think this was one incident during his presidency when he actually did stand up to Putin.
Rose, you talked about modernization in the context of my first question, and both of us are engaged in rather extensive, rather broad programs of modernization. And you and I know that in large measure, some of the Republican response to New START was, if I could put it this way, modified or mollified by an extensive modernization program undertaken in concert with the Senate's approval of New START. And at the same time, we know that on the Russian side, that helped either kick off or otherwise make perhaps more intensive a set of thoughts and ideas which you've outlined in a couple of the new Russian modernization gambits. Are we in a position now of agreeing on arms control against the caveat that it will in one way or another automatically lead to a new set of modernizations, which in time will produce a new urgency about follow-on arms control, and that we are in a way in a kind of modified but not irrelevant arms race, much of which we saw in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where the total number of weapons got up around 70,000, and where for a long time, you in particular have been engaged in bringing those down to more sensible numbers. So how do we fit these what one would have to call converging and not necessarily congruent paradigms of modernization on the one hand and stability and reduced numbers on the other.
It's a very important statement, Tom, of why exactly we need to sustain negotiated arms limitations and continue to develop them going forward. It is in this way that we can modernize our nuclear forces, both we and the Russians, but as I call it, make these modernizations judicious. In fact, for every Sarmat that the Russians now deploy, or whatever new avant-garde, hypersonic glide vehicles they deploy, they are limited under New START to 700 delivery vehicles. So if they introduce a Sarmat into their force structure, they're going to have to decide what else they're going to get rid of. And so that keeps both of us limited in a very significant way. Why do I think modernization is important? I really take my cue here from President Obama and his very serious speech at Prague also in 2010. In fact, just a few days after that April 1 meeting with Medvedev, he went to Prague and delivered this significant speech, so-called Prague Initiative speech, where he said that we should seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons as an active matter of US national policy. But he also said another important caveat, which was he understands this would not be a goal achievable in his lifetime. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, we must maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal. That is why I am completely in agreement with the decision that President Obama made to modernize our nuclear arsenal. It was his decision, and it was a decision he was contemplating in any event. Now, the fact of the ratification process of New START and the interest of certain senators in modernization, I think might have sped up that decision, but the fact that he said already back in Prague that we must maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal. That means, the weapons we have, some of which began their deployment in the 1970s. The first Ohio-class submarine, for example, was launched in 1979. Some of our bombers date back to the 1950s. So once these delivery platforms start to become dangerous to operate or difficult to operate, same goes for nuclear weapons, for the warheads themselves. We have to be able to ensure that they are kept safe, secure, and effective. So I agree that it is time to move forward, but I say it must be a judicious modernization, kept within the limits that we and the Russians negotiate. I hope we can negotiate lower limits on delivery vehicles, because then both of us make some choices. We make some choices about how many we can continue to deploy and what we need to get rid of to deploy modernized systems. That's why I say the modernization must be judicious. By that, I mean it is kept limited by agreed strategic arms limitations.
Modernization is one facet of change in our nuclear posture. Others have suggested out there two or three ideas. One, in addition to reductions of both warheads and delivery vehicles, an opening for separation of warheads from delivery vehicles. Some have suggested that a single land-based member of the triad should perhaps be eliminated in further efforts both to reduce, simplify, and make secure the nuclear deterrent. And there is the regularly appearing no first use of nuclear weapons, admonition, principle, value, whatever you might want to call it. Would you comment briefly on these three things, how you see them in engaging in future arms control, and what place they should have in our own thinking?
Well, I'll give you my short-term view, Tom, and then also talk a little bit about the longer term. First of all, my short-term view is, and I've been actively advising both publicly and privately, that the Biden administration should not spend a lot of time wrestling with declaratory policy. I've served in both the Clinton administration for President Clinton and also for President Obama. I could see the administrations in both cases were wrestling long and hard with the issues surrounding no first use, especially, and having just come from NATO as Deputy Secretary General, I could see the concerns of the allies in these matters. No first use policy does then raise doubts in their minds about the strength of the extended nuclear deterrent, both in Europe and in Asia. And so I think, these are very serious issues, and perhaps they should be discussed and wrestled with. But I urge the administration not to take time with this now and burn political capital and continue to roil our allies at a time. You could just see that Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, was at NATO yesterday. I was so pleased to see how he met with, it looks like, nearly all the NATO allies individually as well as within a group, and spent a lot of time with the NATO Secretary General, with my former boss, Jens Stoltenberg. So they're rebuilding relations with the allies. To my mind, this is not the time to get roiled in another debate about no first use. Fine, it's there. We can talk about it in the future. At the moment, let's keep our eye on the prize of restoring confidence in the allies, number one. And number two, get an additional negotiation going with the Russians to further limit and reduce strategic nuclear offensive forces. Those are the prizes I would keep my eye on, as well as the INF issue and getting China to the table. I would say those are the three prizes I would keep my eye on at the moment. So that is for the near term. For the farther term, people have been raising very good questions about whether, for example, we should dispense with the ICBM leg of the triad, the so-called ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles that are deployed in states across the Midwest and West. Not a huge number of them anymore. And you're quite right, the numbers have come down significantly since the 1960s, when we deployed over 30,000 nuclear. We did not deploy them, I'm sorry. We had built, some of them were deployed, over 30,000 nuclear warheads, and the Russians had built over 40,000 nuclear warheads. The numbers today, they're still high, but we and the Russians both have in our nuclear arsenals, our nuclear warhead arsenals, about 4,000 weapons each. So the numbers have come down significantly over that time, and we need to continue to press lower. But what do we do about this modernization? It is, as President Obama agreed, a triad modernization. So each leg of the triad, land-based ICBMs, sea-based submarines, and air-based bombers and cruise missiles. So what do we do? Is there some scaling back we should consider? To my mind, this is not a question for today. It is a question we should consider very seriously in coming years and think hard about what we will really need to deter going forward, especially as we have a number of emerging technologies. We cannot quite understand the implications of them yet for the future of strategic stability. I'm thinking of particularly artificial intelligence, also quantum computing. At the moment, I have no idea what their implications are going to be for the future of strategic stability. And so I think we should maintain some flexibility thinking about the issue of what the nuclear triad or our nuclear force posture should look like going forward. Maybe we need to place more emphasis on emerging technologies and how we're going to incorporate them into our notions of strategic stability and deterrence. And maybe we can think about, some of these programs are going to be stretched out anyway. It's clear that the ICBM, the new ICBM, that program is going to stretch out into the 2030s. So we have some time to consider exactly what we need to do with the nuclear triad going forward. And so I do urge some careful consideration of that matter, but I'm not at the moment arguing for moving to a dyad and completely getting rid of the ICBMs, but I think it requires some very careful consideration.
Rose, one final question that I think is very much out there. We've touched on it earlier. You spoke with a reasonable sense of confidence that China would become or is now interested in participating, even though the Chinese, I think, gave President Trump a fairly clear, fairly firm answer. Thank you very much. Oh. And Is there, and your implication is that obviously some significant change in the balance with respect to INF missiles, particularly in the region, might be leverage and an inducement in that direction. Do you think that is both necessary and sufficient? It's a kind of build up to build down possibility. On the other hand, the Chinese are there. On the other hand, we are not there with land-based missiles, but we are there with both sea-delivered and air-delivered missiles, roughly in the category that can contend with the INF buildup, principally focused on Taiwan. So are there other pieces of leverage that we should be talking about? Are there other things we should do to induce the Chinese? Or do you see this as a longer term Scrabble that will come about as a result of some iterations of activity rather than something we could look about in seeing three around the table very soon?
Well, it's very interesting, Tom. I have increasingly been thinking that it may be possible to get our Chinese colleagues to the table sooner rather than later. But particularly, I want to say for discussions, not early diving into negotiation, but discussions about what the stability implications are of a number of developments, not only the advent of intermediate range ground launch systems in Asia, but also the new technologies where they have some equality of capability with the United States and Russia. Hypersonic glide is another area where they have had considerable success in building and beginning deployment of some HGV systems. Also, their space-based assets are very significant in terms of their technological prowess. And I think where there is equality, more or less, in technology levels between and among the United States, Russia, and China, I think there could be fruitful areas for discussions. And maybe not immediately thinking in terms of another treaty like the INF Treaty, but are there some initial constraints we can begin to place? Can we begin to develop some measures to enhance mutual transparency, like notifications of flight tests or exchanging data about deployments, perhaps inviting each other to view some of these technologies in informal exhibition types of things rather than strictly negotiated on-site inspections. So I think, it's going to take a while to get the Chinese used to the idea of negotiated constraints on their systems. So I think having discussions, beginning to kind of open the lens for them on what their interests may be. Nobody comes to the table unless they see their national security interests served. The Chinese won't do it as a favor to us or the Russians. But to begin to open the lens for them about where their national security interests may be served by some negotiated restraints, some constraints on some of their systems, I think that is a useful discussion, which could happen sooner rather than later. I would like to draw the attention of everyone listening today to the fact that Vladimir Putin himself, now I said the Russians haven't been particularly helpful in getting the Chinese to the table. You said that, Tom, the Trump administration found that out in trying to get the Russians to help incentivize the Chinese, and it didn't work very well. But I was much struck by President Putin's statement in October. It was a statement that caught everybody's attention because he refreshed the European moratorium proposal and added verification to it and put the 9M729 on the table and said, all right, we don't admit that it's an intermediate range system, but we're willing to constrain it. Keep it out of Europe. Great. All right. Interesting offer. And that, caught everybody's attention. But a little noticed part of that statement is that he also said, we're willing to talk about working with the Chinese on some constraints in Asia. And that was also a very important statement from the president of Russia. So it seems to me that there are some areas where we can perhaps, together with Russia, talk to the Chinese and begin to have some important stability discussions. But I wouldn't push hard and fast to try to have a strict negotiation, because I think that would send them running again, that we would not be able to get them to the table.
Rose, I agree with you. And for some time, I've thought that one of the ways to open the door might be to offer bilateral briefings that would cover, but not be exclusively on, our discussions with the Russians about next steps, as well as things like what our current capabilities are in INF and discuss their current capabilities, things that would produce information that ought to be of interest to them on the one hand, but secondly, not try in one way or another to use that as the immediate opening to some negotiation, that it would be a slow, stepwise measure of exploring in a way the whole question of strategic stability, but particularly related to the bilateral relationship. And this might be, in a sense, three bilateral conversations rather than one bilateral conversation as a way to open the door and get things to begin. I've used up the time I've allowed myself, and Glenn was kind enough to say that he or Dan would pick up on the questions coming from a broader audience, which I think are extremely important. And I know you're willing to entertain those. And so I'll thank you very much for this segment of our discussion, which I found fascinating and very, very useful, and turn it over to Glenn, who will torture you more lightly, but perhaps a little less time as well.
Well, that's fine. Glenn, if I may, before we turn over to you, I can see there are a few questions in the Q&A. Maybe people are thinking of some more. But Tom, I just want to make one last point about the Chinese, because I think you're so right. It's going to take some time to get them to the table, just as I said, just as you said, and I absolutely agree with you. We should not be stuck on a kind of trilateral discussion. Maybe we have a series of bilateral discussions, the Russians and we, with Beijing on this. And I think we have grounds to stay in touch among us. And here, you know, the P5 process, with also including UK and France, has been a way that these 5 countries have been staying in touch on these issues. So I have no problem with variable geometry, as we like to say. But one other point I wanted to make about this, I think we are at a bit of what I call a Glassboro moment with the Chinese. Many people don't remember the Glassboro summit from 1967, but it was when, for the first time, the Americans sat down with the Soviet Politburo leaders and said, here's how we should think about strategic stability in the future. There needs to be, a limit placed on strategic ballistic missile defenses in order to have stable strategic offensive deterrence. I'm not going to go into these arguments now. They're a bit, they're a bit complex. I don't want to take our time. But the point is, at first, the Politburo leadership were clueless. They said, what? We never thought about these issues before because they were the purview of the Soviet military. And within then, that was 1967, but by 1972, President Nixon was able to engage the first serious negotiations with his administration. And Premier Brezhnev was willing to agree to SALT I, to the first strategic arms limitations, and also to the ABM treaty. So I see that kind of process unfolding. That's why I say we're at a bit of a Glassboro moment with the Chinese. We have to take some time to make these cases about what constitutes stability. And it's more complicated today because of the emerging technologies.
Thanks, Rose.
Thank you to both Tom and Rose for the really interesting conversation so far. In the approximately 20 minutes we have left, we'll try to get to as many of the audience questions as we can. And just a reminder, if folks want to continue to submit using the Q&A box, please do so, and we'll try to get to them, even if it means we have to combine some. Let me turn it over to our Dan Mahaffey to field the questions that we've got so far.
Thank you, Glenn. One of the first questions I'll have myself, based on the work that we do at CSPC, is a focus on the congressional dynamics behind arms control, gaining support for arms control efforts, and congressional perceptions on arms control. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on those dynamics right now, and how we can better engage with congressional offices on these topics and restore some of those conversations and working groups on the Hill that are so important for this topic?
Thank you very much, Dan, for that question. You know, I talk in the book about how there were actually two very important negotiations that went on. The first was with the Russians to get the treaty finished, and the second was with the Senate to really achieve the advice and consent to ratification of the treaty. And my biggest lesson from that process is, I think, a lesson you already understand in the work you do. You have to be willing to talk always and at every moment to anyone who shows any interest whatsoever, from the staff level all the way up to the member level. So in New START, we were willing to talk, and we did so for a solid 9 months, from May, when the treaty was sent up to the Senate, to when it was finally voted on at the end of December. And we talked and we talked and we talked. We answered over 1,000 questions for the record. We had over 20 serious hearings and briefings, formal ones, and another, I would say, well, countless numbers of informal briefings, meetings in members' offices, meetings with staff. It didn't matter where it was. It could be the cafeteria, or it could be the Senate floor, not the Senate floor, but off the Senate floor. If they were willing to talk to us and answer their questions, we were willing to do so. And I think that that was the most important factor, because I found that senators were serious about their constitutional responsibility to give advice and consent to treaties if they were freed up by their leadership to consider the issues. And back in 2010, both Republicans and Democrats were freed up by their leaderships to talk about these issues. And they took New START ratification dead seriously. I hope that can be the case in future, because issues that are so much in the national security interest of the United States need to be debated and discussed seriously. And in my view, senators should be allowed to, follow their own intellectual path to see if they can, in conscience, vote for a treaty, rather than saying, no, you can't even consider it. That's our policy. You can't even consider it. So I hope that can be the case in future. We shall see. We have arguments about this now among experts on arms control, whether we'll ever ratify another arms control treaty again. But I think, if the Senate is ducking its advice and consent responsibility, we're in a world of trouble, because important things like trade treaties, economic treaties, other national security treaties with allies, they're not going to get done. Right. If we can't be serious about this important constitutional process. So that's my view on this. I think, your organization is doing the right thing in terms of making available opportunities to talk at every moment, because it's also no question that the level of knowledge on nuclear issues overall and on nuclear arms control issues has dropped precipitously since the 1980s. I very much support groups like the National Security Working Group that continues to hold meetings on these questions. And I really applaud your efforts, again, to engage and talk with staffers every day in every way about these issues, but on up to members, of course, when the opportunities present.
Well, thank you for those words of support, and it's made possible by you sharing the time to join us here. But some of the other questions I see here too, asking about leverage and some of these new technologies, hypersonics, but we also hear things like nuclear cruise missile discussion, underwater nuclear torpedoes, doomsday weapon type things. How do we interpret those in an arms control dialogue, as well as discussions of what technologies the U.S. might need for leverage in arms control negotiations?
Yes, I think those are important questions. I think we cannot shortchange these significant new developments in the Russian force posture, the way they are developing some of these new kinds of systems, particularly the nuclear propelled ones, like the Burevestnik cruise missile that, we've never seen anything like it before. Although the idea of nuclear propulsion has been around since the 1950s, we abandoned it long ago because of difficulty of maintaining stable propulsion with a nuclear engine of this kind. So the Russians are obviously wrestling with this. They had a serious accident in August of 2018 up off Arkhangelsk. They're wrestling with it. So the technologies aren't easy, but the point is they're driving toward deployment. So, okay, what are we going to do about it? First of all, I do believe we need to engage a serious negotiation with them on these new kinds and seek to limit and perhaps to prevent their deployment. We shall see what the Russians will be willing to negotiate about, but they too have some constraints to think about. They've just spent a load of rubles modernizing their mobile ICBM force. This is the heart and soul of their force structure. And are they going to really trade off what is a brand new missile with a kind of shaky operational history, at least in the testing phase, for the heart and soul of their nuclear force structure, which are the mobile ICBMs? Again, it's that importance of keeping New START limits in place as we negotiate the next phase. They have to make choices. They have freedom to mix. They can put as many Burevestniks in the force structure if it were limited by the treaty or the next treaty, but we have to keep them limited in that way. And that's why I think it will be important to negotiate about them specifically. And, they'll have to think about what their choices are going to be going forward in terms of their own nuclear force structure, but they're also going to have their own asks on the table. I cannot foresee what they are at the moment, but I know hints from history that they are very concerned about our own, as they call it, prompt global strike capability, which are long-range, conventionally armed delivery systems. They're very concerned about that. I can see us, being willing to look at making some trades in that area. We already have a kind of permit and count rule in New START, so we permit some, conventionally armed long-range systems, but they have to be counted under the nuclear limits of New START. So I could see us being willing to go somewhere in that direction. The area where I'm not so certain about what will be possible in the US political environment is limits on missile defenses. This has always been a serious no-go zone for the United States. And I think, thinking about ways where we might have some mutual restraint in this area, because the Russians too are modernizing their missile defenses in a very serious way and developing some systems even for export, like the S-500, that have some significant capabilities against intercontinental range systems. Okay, well, if they want to limit our missile defenses, let's talk to them about the future of their missile defense programs as well, and make it into a real discussion, leading perhaps to a negotiation about what makes sense on the defense side of the equation going forward. But at the moment, I can't tell for sure what the United States will be willing to do in terms of limiting defenses. But I can tell you for absolute sure that it will continue to be a concern of the Russian Federation, number one. And number two, it will continue to be a concern for many in the United States, in our Senate, in our military force structure. They don't want to see any limits on missile defenses. So those are some conundrums we're going to have to address going forward. But I urge us to do so with some attention to the new capabilities in missile defense technology developing on the Russian side, and not allow them to just beat us up all the time about our missile defense developments. Two can play at this game.
No, and I think that's a good point on missile defense, and it segues to another question, though, from the audience, is missile defense rendered increasingly moot by hypersonics?
Well, that's the bet that Vladimir Putin is making, that high speed will render moot missile defenses. It's a really good question. That's why he has said that systems like the Burevestnik, which is a supersonic system, is something that, undermines missile defenses. And so the Russian Federation can be confident going forward in its force structure. And he's made that case specifically about speed. And so I actually feel that there is some opening in that way for the Russians to have some discussions of this matter. They seem rather confident, actually, in their ability to overcome any missile defense technology that we may be deploying in the foreseeable future. So although on the other side, I've also heard them express some grave concerns about the testing of the missile defense interceptor against an ICBM target. So they have been expressing some concerns about that. Those tests took place in the last 6 months or so, and it's been a concern to the Russians. So, as you get ready for a negotiation, you have to pay attention to the various signals you get. Sometimes you hear from a president that, oh, we're confident. We can handle anything you throw at us in terms of missile defenses. And then sometimes you hear from some experts that they're not very happy about some of the testing we've been doing. So you have to judge, where does the confidence level come down on the Russian side as you're scoping out your negotiation?
There's a question here that asks, and I think it's an interesting way of asking. It says, is there a way for our rivals to have to maintain dozens of obsolete systems? But it's a question that I think, too, as you say, looking at the capabilities and the situation of these negotiating partners, what are some of their trade-offs that they're facing in terms of costs, modernization, et cetera, that we should be aware of as we negotiate with them?
Well, I frankly think that's one reason why we might be able to gain some trades with regard to the new kinds that they're coming up with. These systems, again, like the nuclear propelled systems, they are operationally very difficult to operate, and they're expensive to build and deploy. So I can see the Russians thinking, again, back to my earlier point, the heart and soul of their force structure are the very capable mobile ICBMs that they built and deployed over years, which are also very capable in eluding our missile defenses because they've made a real specialty out of deploying on those missiles various kinds of chaff and decoys, ways to basically undermine our missile defense capability. So to my mind, they've just modernized that force, and how much additional investment are they going to lay into these new kinds of systems that are chancy? By comparison with the ICBMs, they're chancy to operate and expensive. Mm-hmm. So these are some considerations. We'll never know, exactly what's going on either in the decision making of the Russian Ministry of Defense nor in the Kremlin. But I can imagine that they are considering some of those trade-offs. Do they really want to sacrifice a very capable and reliable set of missile systems for something new and something uncertain?
Question from the audience asks, is there a future for conventional arms control in Europe?
I certainly hope so, because it's high time we are serious about thinking about refurbishing the set of regimes in Europe one by one. They have fallen by the wayside. The Cfe Treaty, Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Russians ceased implementing it in 2007. We do continue to implement it, and I do think it continues to build some important confidence in and among the European partners and states, including our allies who are still involved in it as we are involved in it. There's still notifications of force structure being exchanged and inspections that go on and so forth. But we need to have the Russians involved. Clearly, that's a no-brainer. And unfortunately and sadly, the Open Skies Treaty seems to be going by the wayside, although I hope, and there are some interesting ideas about how to put it back in place, refurbish it, modernize it, et cetera. I think we do need to pursue that because cooperative aerial monitoring is extraordinarily important for the future, and not only for security and military confidence building, but I can see other future uses such as cooperative monitoring for environmental purposes. Let's think about what we would see an interest in terms of a modernized and refurbished Open Skies Treaty. So there's some important work to do in that regard. And the Vienna document confidence building regime is also really suffering because the Russians have been refusing to properly implement it. So again, we have to think about ways to get the Russians back seriously engaged on conventional arms control. But to do that, we have to take it seriously and pay some attention to it. And it's been very much, in my mind, it has been neglected in recent years. But one more point, I think, for everybody listening to consider on this arena of conventional arms control, we don't need to go back to the CFE Treaty. We don't need to go back to those kinds of limitations on hardware because the numbers have come down thanks to CFE, thanks to other even economic reasons in various countries across Europe, the numbers have come down significantly. So can we focus on other ways to scope the treaties rather than insisting on further reductions? We need to have better confidence in what the Russians are doing on the borderlands with NATO. To my mind, that's a top priority. So how can we build up confidence in that way rather than really seeking elimination and reductions in conventional forces? So that would be my view of the top priority here. Let's figure out a way to incentivize the Russians. They say they're worried about NATO force structures. All right, how do we get back to the table again in the arena of serious confidence building and predictability measures?
One other question from the audience has to do with Beijing and the idea of getting them to the table on intermediate forces. But their ballistic missile arsenal so key to their core interests of Taiwan, A2AD in the Pacific. What do you think of the logic that the U.S. has to achieve intermediate range parity of some kind before we can get them to the table?
I think that's one aspect of why the Chinese have been so, I think, reluctant to engage serious discussions in this area so far, is they do see that a set of missile capabilities as being right at the heart of their own defensive arsenal. But to be honest with you, I think they're also seeing the INF treaty, and they are worried that a new INF treaty would be what would be negotiated. The INF treaty, although it has the N in it, Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, it banned all missiles in these intermediate ranges, both cruise missiles and ballistic missiles in Europe, because we could not distinguish between nuclear and conventional. We were unwilling at the time it was negotiated in the 1980s to do the kind of intrusive on-site inspection that would enable us to distinguish nuclear from conventional missiles. Now, at least with the Russian Federation, that has changed in the ensuing 30 plus years, because now in the New START treaty, we are doing reentry vehicle on-site inspections that are distinguishing conventional from nuclear objects on the front end of strategic range missiles, of ICBMs, SLBMs. So can we talk to the Chinese about a new type of limitation on intermediate range, precisely nuclear forces? I call it putting the N back in INF. Let's limit or even ban nuclear missiles that fly to intermediate ranges and allow conventional missiles of those ranges to be deployed, again, with certain restraints and constraints on them, and subject to on-site inspection and so forth. So I think that's the other issue that we have to really convey to the Chinese, that we're not seeking a ban on all such missiles that are right at the heart of their arsenal. We are looking to limit and maybe ban, but limit the nuclear missiles in that range.
As we're wrapping up here, the final questions, the overall themes of strategic stability, and just your thoughts on how negotiators need to perhaps consider cyber or other things, not to overcomplicate, but how these factors also fit into strategic stability.
Well, they definitely fit in, and we need to be considering them. I think we need to think differently about trying to control or restrain cyber tools, cyber capabilities, cyber weapons, however you want to characterize them, because we're talking here not about hardware but software. In some ways we've had it kind of easy in the last 50 years of nuclear arms control, because we've been talking about big items of hardware that are easy to see even from outer space and to count, to eliminate. We know when they've cut up an ICBM, they know when we've cut up a bomber. These things are easy to account for. In cyberspace, it's different. So we have to think about different ways to steer constraints on cyber capabilities. I think a normative overlay is very important. What are certain principles in terms of how we will use or not use our cyber capabilities. One example I like to put out there is, can we agree that we should not be meddling with each other's national command authorities? We should not be trying to undermine or destroy their capability to be able to communicate with their nuclear forces. It's in everybody's interest not to see surprise or some kind of accidental launch because a national command authority has been meddled with. So I think talking first about some kinds of normative principles, talking about some kinds of mutual confidence building in measures of restraint. There's already been significant work that's gone on in that area over the last decade in a UN group of government experts and additional expert discussions that have been going on. There's something to build on there, but we should not think that we can somehow do cyber arms control in the same way we have done nuclear arms control over the last 50 years.
Well, that covers the questions from our audience. So thank you, ma'am, and thank you for your time.
We covered a whole lot of ground, and I just want to say thanks to Dan for fielding the audience questions, and to Ambassador Pickering for opening the conversation with the Honorable Rose Gottemoeller. I just reposted the book in the chat box. Please do take a look at Negotiating the New START Treaty for even more details and anecdotes on how this was done. Rose, you mentioned, thank you for putting the emphasis on the need to work with the Senate and ensure that they're bought into the conversations, and that trying to achieve some level of bipartisan cooperation there to support negotiations is vital. We hope that our work is additional to that of others in this area. We've partnered with with Senator Nunn and Secretary Moniz at NTI, and trying to support their efforts. And I know there are others as well working on these issues. Your expertise will be vital in that. We hope we can continue to engage you, and we deeply thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
It was truly my pleasure. Thank you to Ambassador Pickering, to you, Glenn Nye, and to Dan Mahaffey. It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Be safe.
Thank you very much.
Bye.